I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. Even though it's a small group, you're going to get a great presentation tonight. So the topic tonight obviously is we're talking about emotional stress. And to give you an overview of what I'm going to cover tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about stress itself, what stress really is, how it affects your body, how it affects your physiology. And then we're going to break away from that. We're going to talk really about what I think are some of the most important things that you can do to cope with stress. I'm actually going to spend some time in the middle of the presentation talking about how our plan fits into God's plan and what the Bible says about stress, because I think that's an important aspect of stress. I'm going to talk about in a second that a big part of how much stress affects your body is your perceived level of influence over that stress, whether or not you feel helpless or not. And the scriptures have something to say about this. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about exercise, how that affects stress. I'm going to talk about some nutritional aspects of stress. We're going to talk, or I'm just going to mention, because most of you are familiar with this already, about the beneficial effects of chiropractic care for allowing your body to cope better with stress. I'm going to talk about some stress reduction techniques, some meditation, some visualization, and some breathing techniques that you can use at any time to help your body to cope with stressful situations, and things you can do proactively ahead of time to train your body at getting better to handle stress. Okay? And then we have a guest speaker, Diana Tice. She's a Heartmath Provider, and she's going to talk about some other tools that you can use for managing stress. And she's also going, at the end, she's volunteered. She's going to talk at the end, and then she's volunteered to do a demonstration of what exactly her technique is and how you can utilize it for helping to cope with stress. Okay? So, emotional stress is something that we all have in common. In other words, the only people that don't have stress are people that have moved on, people that aren't alive anymore. It's universal, okay? So, but we sometimes use the word stress as if it's always negative. Actually, scientifically, that's not true at all. As a matter of fact, there's two different types of stress. There's eustress, which is really what most researchers think of as being positive stress, and then there's distress. Most of the time when we use the word stress in a negative sense, we're really talking about distress. Now, I'm going to try tonight during my presentation to use the word distress, but I will occasionally slip up and just use the generic term stress. But as I said, stress of one kind or another is universal and not necessarily negative. Okay? As I'm going to mention in a few minutes, a big part of what allows that stress to either negatively affect your health or not depends upon, as I said, your level of influence over that stress, whether you feel like you're in control of it or not. So eustress is normal stress. It's really what makes life interesting. A classic example would be like the last slide, somebody on a roller coaster. You know, when you're chugging up that hill up to the top right before you fall over, it's very stressful, but that's what makes it fun. Another classic example of stress would be in a teaching situation. If you didn't have the stress of an exam or a paper that was due or a deadline, you may not be nearly as productive, or your students may not be nearly as productive because they wouldn't have any reason to produce or to perform. And so eustress is that effect. What's interesting with stress in general is that one of the things besides your level of influence over the stress is that the level of stress will affect your productivity. So for example, let's say you're an employee that has a quota of a certain amount of workload you have to do or a certain amount of sales you have to generate. Research shows that under a certain amount of stress, your performance will improve. But what happens is once the stress gets to a certain point, your productivity drops way off. And so just like most things in life, moderation is the key. Even things that we would consider to be good stress, like, say, a wedding or the birth of a child or a new marriage or whatever, those things can sometimes still be perceived as a negative stress if it pushes our limit of stress over what we can cope with. Okay? I always tell people that the best way to remember eustress is that it's what makes life interesting. Like if you go to a movie and it makes you laugh, or you go to a movie that makes you cry, the things that we tend to remember or affect us emotionally are related to stress. Okay? So that eustress or beneficial stress. And the distress is what you want to diminish or that you want to prevent from affecting your health, because that's what negatively affects your health. It decreases your productivity, as I said, and it becomes stress, for the most part, when it's beyond our ability to recover, to adapt, or it's perceived as out of our control. Now, control, as I'm going to get to in a second, like I said, I'm going to talk about some of the religious or biblical bases of what God's perception of stress is that one of the problems with stress is that we believe that we are in control, when from a Christian or most religious standpoints, really God is in control. And so there's a little bit more to it than just that perceived sense of control, that sometimes giving up control can be a very positive thing when it comes to stress and how we relate to stress, to realize that we don't have to be on top of every single aspect, because in reality, we don't have as much to say about how our life goes as we would like to think many times. Okay? So more specifically, how does stress affect your health? Physiologically, stress is what's called a fight or flight response, and it has a predictable effect on your physiology, how your body functions. The best way to remember this is that fight or flight or stress response is a survival mechanism. It's literally the way you react in a life or death situation. So, the classic example that I use is you're walking through the woods and you get attacked by a bear, or you get attacked by a mountain lion or something, and your body is going to go into this fight or flight mode, okay? It's all about survival. So your heart rate speeds up, your adrenaline glands kick in, your muscles all tighten up. It's your body preparing for action, so either to fight or to run. The problem is that your body doesn't know the difference between a bear or a mountain lion attacking you and having an argument with your spouse, or your boss taking out his frustrations on you, or whatever, even more, things that aren't physically damaging, but things like, a divorce, or somebody that's struggling with substance abuse, or whatever the stress is in your life, it causes the same physiological response. And unfortunately, many of us, to some degree, like I said, are under distress on a 24/7 hour, every day, 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 day a week kind of a perception. So, some of the things that surprise people are that when you're under that fight or flight response, your immune system is decreased. Your digestion is decreased. And you probably experience this. When you're under stress, if you're nervous about something, usually your stomach, feels upset. Okay. I mentioned that your muscles are activated. It actually shunts some of the blood supply going to your digestion in order to send more of that blood to your muscles to prepare you for action. That's why if somebody gets mad, usually their face flushes, because it sends more blood to the surface. The other side of that is if you're chronically in stress, you don't digest food well. You don't absorb food well. Your immune system, like I said, doesn't function. And it makes sense when you think about that this is a survival mechanism, that if you don't get away from that bear or that mountain lion, it doesn't really matter whether you digest your lunch, okay, or whether you can fight off that bacteria, okay? So your body is designed, to kind of look at what's the highest priority of what do I need to do to survive, okay? So what research shows, though, is that you cannot be healthy and be healing and be adapting and be in that fight or flight mode at the same time. They're mutually exclusive, okay? So for your body to function normally, I used a couple examples like digestion and your adrenal glands and so forth, but it really affects all aspects of your physiology. Your body cannot be growing and developing, and for example, like when I'm treating a patient with chiropractic care, they can't be healing and making improvement if they have significant unresolved stress, because their body just isn't going to be in that healing mode. It's still in that survival mode. So that's one of the reasons that this workshop is so important, is that, as I'm going to talk about in a second, stress can cause subluxations, the kind of problems we treat as chiropractors, but it also can prevent people from healing or getting the kind of improved health that they need. Okay, so one of the questions that sometimes will come up is, why don't I seem to be healing? And stress isn't always the culprit, but a lot of times it can be part of the equation. I would say in my experience, I've been in practice for 18 years now, that the number one cause of subluxations in most people is emotional stress, not physical falls and injuries and those kind of things. All right, so we'll kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about what the Bible and what God, and there's a lot of scriptures that I could go to. This is one of my favorite scriptures, and I have to preface this by saying I am not a trained, theologian or pastor lifelong Christian and I study the Bible regularly, but I'm not an expert, but I'm going to share with you some of the things that I think are important to me as my understanding of stress. This verse I love because if you're not familiar with it, it's St. Paul writing to the church in Philippi, to the Philippians. And right prior to this, the start of this is that this discussion, this letter he's writing them, is because there's two women actually in this group that are having an argument. It doesn't say in the Bible why they're having an argument, but I'm going to kind of go through this. And I know you can read it, but I'm going to read it to you. It says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I say again, rejoice." So one of his things of advice is, I know you're having an argument right now, but you should be glad. You should be glad because this is a new church we've set up. Christianity is in its youth. You know, they should be excited about Christ. They should be excited about Christ in the world and not be worrying about these arguments that they're having. Your kindness should be known to all. The Lord is near. And I love this part. It says, "Have no anxiety at all, but in everything by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God." And what he's saying here is, that, first of all, that we shouldn't be anxious. That's not part of God's plan for us. But also, in everything we do, we should approach it from a prayerful aspect. And we should expect, when he says, with prayer and petition with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God, he's saying basically we want to thank God for answering our prayers before we even ask them. Okay? He's saying expect to be answered. Now, as I'm going to talk about in a second, it may not be answered in your time frame or the way you want. There's a country song. I'm not a big country fan, but there's a country song by Garth Brooks that the main verse is thank God for unanswered prayers. You know that God knows what we need better than we know what we need. Okay, but and then it says then the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. So not just is this verse promising peace, but it's promising peace beyond all understanding. So in other words, you might be in a situation, again, you might be somebody, and I know you're not, but you could, speaking to a bigger audience, you might be somebody that's watching this video that might be struggling with some severe stress. Maybe your business just failed, or maybe your spouse just left you, or maybe you're struggling with some kind of addiction. But God says that if you do what He wants, if you trust in Him and you rejoice and you pray to Him with expectation that your prayers are going to answer, that your peace is going to be beyond what you expect. And then this last part is just so common sense, but it's wonderful to see it in the Scriptures, that it says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there's any excellence and if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things." Okay? And so that's,